One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The treasurer.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and today we're bringing you guests from our 2020 webinar series. There's nothing like a US presidential election, a global pandemic, and aggressive trade threats from China to make you think about Australia's friends, enemies, and allies. And that's the subject of today's podcast.
Australian industries are bracing for more trade restrictions from China as diplomatic tensions reach boiling point.
Tons of live Australian lobsters are stranded on the tarmac at a Chinese...
Australian beef, barley, wine and lobster, and could soon suspend copper, sugar and tea.
Beef and barley. It's also told mills to stop using Australian cotton. So,
after disputes over the coronavirus and foreign interference.
Retaliation for Australia spearheading America's anti-China campaign.
We have waged a fierce battle against the invisible enemy, the China virus.
Foreign Minister demanding an independent international inquiry.
Well, we need to know the sorts of details that an independent review would identify for us about the genesis of the virus, about the approaches to dealing with it and addressing with it, about the openness with which information was shared. We share some of the concerns that the United States have identified in relation to the World Health Organization. That is certainly correct.
Australian jobs are at stake, and the government needs to do more than just observe.
Our phone is always on and our door is always open.
Australian Foreign Affairs is the country's leading foreign affairs journal, produced by Schwartz Media. In the 10th issue of AFA, it examines the alliances, blocs and rivalries emerging across the Asia-Pacific as nations adjust to the changing balance of power in the region. And it considers Australia's diplomatic options as loyalties shift in an increasingly turbulent region. To discuss the issue of AFA, we spoke to Karen Middleton, whom many of you will be familiar with as a Canberra-based journalist and author and the chief political correspondent at the Saturday paper. Karen has 30 years' experience covering national and international affairs. And Jonathan Pearlman is the editor of Australian Foreign Affairs and the world editor of the Saturday paper. He previously worked at the Sydney Morning Herald, covering foreign affairs and politics from Canberra and Sydney. And they were in conversation with Allan Behm, Director of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs Program. This was recorded live on Friday the 13th of November 2020, and things may have changed since recording. Turns out there's nothing like a US presidential election, a global pandemic, and aggressive trade threats from China to make you think about Australia's friends, enemies, and allies. So the timing of today's webinar is fortuitous. So welcome, Karen, Jonathan and Allan. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got, I think, about 700 people registered, and I can see about 380 on the line with us. Thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. Jonathan, I might start with you. Obviously, there's plenty happening in the world at the moment that's making us both focus on our friends, allies and enemies in the region. I wonder if you could just, for those of us who perhaps haven't read the whole issue, give us a flavour of what are some of the issues that Australia has to consider at the moment and some of the problems that we have to confront.
Sure, and thanks, Ebony. Thanks for hosting this event. There's a lot of constant debate on all sorts of topics in Australian foreign affairs, but there actually seems to be a bit of a consensus now about what Australia's fundamental foreign policy problem is. And I'm sure we're all familiar with the problem, but the problem is this. Our main security partner is the United States, has been for a long time, and its role in the world and the region is changing. Its own commitment, its commitment to maintaining its primacy in Asia has come under question, and we've obviously seen a whole lot of turbulence and unpredictability about America's role in the world under Donald Trump for the past 4 years. On the flip side, our main trading partner is China. China is threatening America's place in this region, and it is also becoming increasingly ambitious, but also really belligerent, I think you could put it, under Xi Jinping. And Australia is caught between caught in this bind between its main security partner and its main trading partner. Now, there actually is generally consensus around that overall picture of Australia's dilemma. In terms of how to respond, which is really what this issue of Australian and foreign affairs looks like, the government's response, and this also comes a lot from the sort of foreign policy commentariat, presents a fairly simple, I think, response, which is, or it sounds simple, which is, well, if we can't completely rely on the US anymore for our future security in Asia, let's find new partners in the region, new allies in the region. You constantly hear references to like-minded partners, and Scott Morrison was talking about that this week, and he's about to jet off to, he announced that he's going to jet off to Japan. So the answer that you constantly hear from the government is that we'll find new like-minded partners that we will work with to kind of compensate for our lack of ability to rely on the US. And I think this raises a whole lot of questions, and what we've tried to do in this issue is answer some of those questions. So, for instance, how viable is this? I mean, are there other partners that could fill the shoes of the US or could try to fill the shoes of the US? How solid a commitment can we expect from these sorts of countries? And will it be a commitment that extends to a military sort of umbrella like we have currently with the US? And if we are going to try and kind of find these new partners and allies, who are they, and what do we need to do to try to build up these partnerships? And some of the essays look at this. I mean, it's great to have Karen here today because her piece, I think, raises some questions about whether Australia is really doing enough to put itself in a position to attract new partners. So that's a sense of the questions that we're trying to answer in this issue.
Thanks, Jonathan. Karen, that might take me next to you. You have really looked at in your essay both how foreign aid and diplomacy might be means to strengthen our ties with our neighbours, but are we actually doing that? Reading your essay, it seemed like there's a lot of rhetoric there, but perhaps not so much in terms of action.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. Thanks, Ebony. I think that's the problem, that we've got a lack of consistency, and we've got unmatching rhetoric and reality. But I looked particularly at Southeast Asia, and I looked at this issue of the Indo-Pacific, as we now call it. And, it struck me that we're very, very focused on the Indo end, and the Indo came from India originally rather than Indonesia. We're very focused on that end. And the Prime Minister is clearly focusing heavily on the relationship with both India and Japan at the moment, in the vein that Jonathan was just talking about new allies and framing relationships. And he's also very focused on the Pacific. He's got a lot of personal experience with the Pacific. He lived in New Zealand for a while. I think he finds a cultural familiarity with the Pacific. There are a lot of Christian countries there as well. But we're not so focused anymore on our near neighbourhood in Southeast Asia. We've kind of dropped the ball on that. We've dropped it in terms of aid. Our aid overall is frozen for the last 5 years, but our aid there has really dropped away. And our diplomatic relationships are a bit taken for granted. And I think one of the sub-themes that I ended up looking at was this idea about our sort of inconsistency on foreign policy, which isn't just about Southeast Asia, but it's really obvious there. We keep flip-flopping on policy positions, and it's confusing to our neighbours. And I'm not really sure whether the government thinks it doesn't get noticed, but it does. And the danger there is that we're becoming perceived as a very self-interested country. And I don't mean that just as self-interest in terms of Australia's national self-interest, which is natural for every country. That's an objective of every government, is to look after their own people first. But I mean domestic political self-interest. And the risk is that we're becoming really inconsistent in our messaging. And a good example of that we've seen just in the last reminder again yesterday when the Prime Minister spoke about his call to the President-elect Joe Biden. And he talked up very much, Scott Morrison talked about the value of multilateral fora and how, important that's going to be. Whereas just last year he gave a speech where he talked about negative globalism and that we weren't interested in multilateral fora so much anymore. And then the foreign minister gave a speech sort of tidying that up a bit. So it's confusing. And we've made policy decisions that have offended our neighbours without much explanation. And I think of the Jerusalem embassy issue, which was something that was announced during the Wentworth by-election with domestic politics in mind, the constituency, particularly in Wentworth, the announcement that we were going to move our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in Israel. Seems like, why would anyone get upset about that in the local in the local neighbourhood? Well, it's a big deal for Indonesia. Indonesia is very strong, pro-Palestinian. It's a non-aligned country. It takes that issue extremely seriously. And we didn't foreshadow that. It means a lot to Indonesia that we were doing what we were doing on Israel. So there's a lack of the big picture. There's a lack of consistency. There's a bit of short-termism that's crept into our foreign policy. It's evident in the neighbourhood, but I think it's evident further afield than that. And it's coming home to roost a little bit because we're caught between things. The issue of climate change is another example where we've been inconsistent policy-wise, across a number of governments, and now we may pay a price for that. We should be consistent in our policy positions and in the way we practice our politics and our diplomacy, and I think we haven't been, and that's a danger for Australia.
Alan, I'll come to you now. You've got an essay about having a donors conference, but we might get into that a little bit later. I wanted to come to you actually about Rory Medcalf's essay in this issue, where he puts his money on the Quad, the association between the US, Japan, Australia and India. Do you think that's a strategic alliance that we should be looking at? And will that type of approach work to ameliorate some of the issues that Karen's essay has raised, do you think?
Ebony, thank you. I'd start by endorsing everything that Karen just said, because I will answer your question, I think, very much in the terms of Karen's essay, which is essentially, at least as I understood your essay, Karen, that Australia has actually a fair bit of agency, but it chooses not to use it. It also has a capacity for leadership, not least of all because we've got extremely highly educated politicians by and large. They sometimes don't look that way, but they actually are. And yet we choose for very complex reasons not to exercise our agency, nor to exercise that kind of empowering leadership that would, I think, make an enormous contribution to the long-term stability and security of Asia and the Pacific. Instead, what we are inclined to do is to go everywhere in reverse, looking through the rearview mirror. So we look at things like the concert of Europe and we say, well, no, we're in Asia and we can't have anything like the concert of Europe, but we can have alliances and coalition arrangements that look like treaties that began in the 19th century, and we've exploited them through the later part of the 20th century. And here we are, almost into the first third of the 21st century, talking about static arrangements like the Quad. I've been around long enough to have attended the last CETO meeting that was conducted in Canberra in 1972. And one of the reasons for the failure of CETO, and there were many reasons for it really, but
Alan,
one of them...
For people who aren't familiar, what is CETO?
Oh, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organisation, which was a kind of Asian replica of NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. So one of the reasons that CETO fell over was that it tried to bridge half a dozen completely different cultures that were incapable of dealing one with another. And to put them all in some kind of homogeneous treaty arrangement simply was never going to work. And so we have the Quad, which brings together 3.5 quite different cultures. My half is that the Americans and the Australians are sort of the same, but we are actually quite different because we've got quite different interests. So we have Japan, India, the United States and Australia coming together for reasons that everybody can see are designed to constrain, if not contain, China. And ultimately, for Australia to rely on Japan, India, and the United States as part of a strategic effort to constrain and or contain China is, frankly, to put a high premium on hope and to have pay no attention whatsoever to our experience. So while my friend Rory Medcalf, who is a very good friend of mine, tells us that the Quad is here to stay, I think the Quad will last about as long as CETO lasted.
Jonathan, I might come back to you next. I guess the next thing that I wanted to ask about was China, essentially, and I guess the shift that we might be contemplating now with a new US administration that might be taking a different approach in the region, but maybe not so much. But in the context of the US election and the presidential result there, Hugh's essay talks about Australia's solution to our self-reliance and alliance with the US being a diplomatic coalition in the region, increased reliance on a self-reliant defence capability. Do you think President Joe Biden presents us with a new opportunity? Do you think what Hugh's essay talks about a self-reliant defence capability is a useful approach? What are some of the limitations there, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are huge limitations on what Joe Biden can achieve. I think that he will change America's China policy to some extent. It's interesting if you go back to the beginning of the Trump presidency. I mean, Trump's foreign policy wavers so much, and often for just purely domestic political reasons, that it's hard to kind of keep track of what he's trying to achieve. But it's interesting if you go back 4 years ago to when he first came in, and remember he hosted Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago, tried to present Xi Jinping as described him as a close friend and as a potential close partner. And the aim really was that Trump was going to impose all these trade tariffs on China, which he did. But that was all going to be part of moving towards some big deal between him and Xi Jinping, and they were going to kind of go into a room together and walk out with some great deal. But that approach, where sort of it's not the US pitching China as some big ideological Cold War style enemy, but as a country with which it has trade and commercial disputes which it could resolve, and otherwise, let's work with whoever's head of China. That's been completely lost, and the reason is that the White House itself was always divided between two camps as to whether it should be a sort of trade war with China or an all-out, Cold War style war, and the latter prevailed to some extent only this year. Because after the coronavirus pandemic broke out, and Trump started to really frame China as an enemy, I think, to defend his own failings in handling the coronavirus pandemic. And so where we've ended up today is this all-out ideological battle where China and the US are presented as fierce rivals. I think Biden will go back a little bit, more towards what we saw in the early days of the Trump presidency. He will continue to confront China on trade. He has his own sort of protectionist tendencies, and that's really where the US is headed overall. So there will still be battles with China, but I think that he will also look for areas of cooperation, such as on climate change, maybe even on dealing with the pandemic. So we'll see an attempt to find a more kind of moderate approach. I don't think, though, that there's great hope for, in the long term for US-China moving closely together, because their interests are just so different, particularly in this region. China is trying to assert itself in the region. Xi Jinping is a much more aggressive leader, and whose human rights breaches are horrific. And he Trump, that didn't bother Trump, but it will bother Biden and the Democrats. So there's going to be a clash of interests, and that clash is going to continue, I think, for the next 4 years.
Alan, I'll come back to you just to follow up on China there. You've talked a lot about Australia reinvesting in diplomacy and trying to develop more allies in the region, because obviously as a middle power, Australia can't constrain China, a superpower, on its own. How much do you think the new US administration will shift what Australia has to do in terms of achieving its aims when it comes to China?
Well, we began this program, Ebony, by noting that Australia has shifted already. And I think that we're going to do a lot more shifting yet, because our basic approach to the conduct of our foreign policy is to do it on reflex. We'll follow the United States almost always, and that sometimes is useful and sometimes it's not. But I think in the context of where Biden might take the United States, I think a lot of the structural issues that are so deep in that relationship that do need to be redressed, particularly around the economic relationship, will stay. I think what will differ will be the tone and the mechanisms by which the Biden administration seeks to deal with those. Now, that'll depend a bit on whom he has around him and who's going to be advising him. But the ones who are sort of popping up all the time in sort of commentary about what his administration is going to look like, they're all pretty well known to us. We know what their thoughts are and what their thinking is. We know about the pivot that Kurt Campbell, for example, was pushing so hard under the Obama administration. And I think there'll be bits of that sort of stuff coming back into the way in which the Biden administration approaches its relationship with China. But I think we need to just think a little bit beyond that. For me, in this particular edition of AFA, the most interesting essay was Patrick Lawrence's one, because, and curiously, there's an interesting alignment, I think, between Karen's essay and Patrick Lawrence's, because they're dealing with what Australia should do in its own interests to accommodate what's actually already happening in Southeast Asia. And I think one of the points that Patrick makes is that the Southeast Asians themselves are no longer really interested in the military first approach to dealing with China. They're much more inclined to do what they do amongst themselves within the ASEAN framework, which is to talk to each other. And so I think that what Patrick is saying is, look, Sinophobia is not going to get you anywhere, because the United States is relatively in decline and China is relatively on the rise. What we need to do is to accommodate both those facts, and the best way of accommodating them is to do it collectively, but not necessarily through things that look like militarily defined alliances supported by a range of military exercises. I think that the point that he also makes, which struck me, was that we do need to distinguish between strength and power. And this again is where I think Karen is on the money, that Australia has quite a lot of power, but we seek not to use it. And so a reinvestment in focused development assistance, particularly exploiting the opportunity that the coronavirus actually offers, because that is something in which we all have to act collectively, makes real sense. So it's not that we turn off investment in our defence capacities, but we don't give our first priority to defence and military structures as a way of containing or constraining China. We give first priority to our ability to engage with China in the economic and security interests of everybody. And of course, you've got to have something in your back pocket, and that's more or less what Hugh is saying. But I don't start with what's in your back pocket. I start with what you want. And I think that in a way, that is where we really need to be going. And if the step up is to mean anything in the Pacific, it has to be mirrored by a step up in Asia.
Karen, I'll come back to you. Alan talks just about every week in our staff meeting about what coronavirus is doing to Indonesia, our very close neighbour. And you kind of talked about how the Indo-Pacific started out as being about India, but then moved much more towards Indonesia. Obviously, the recent announcement of, I think it's $1.5 billion potential loan to Indonesia just in the last couple of days. That would have been well before you finished your essay. But do you think that is a sign that the government knows it has to do a better job and that's the beginning of that? Or do you think that's likely to be kind of a one-off gesture?
Is it a sign the government's been reading our essays? I hope so. Yes, I did notice that loan facility, and there was also an announcement preceding that with more money about the coronavirus and Indonesia as well, which I think is also welcome. Look, I don't know what's necessarily behind it, but I think it's a good thing that they've at least offered this loan facility. And one of the points I was making in that essay is that we hadn't done it. You know, we were sort of somehow not seeing this crisis in the same way that we saw, say, the tsunami or something else. And, you know, the Asian financial crisis, for example, where we'd stepped up to assist countries in Southeast Asia, particularly, very urgently, whereas somehow, because this was a less visible and a more creeping crisis, that we weren't doing that so much. So I was quite glad in the context both of COVID-19 and more broadly that we're doing this kind of thing now. I think it's important. But it comes back to this consistency as well. It always seems to be just a bit rushed and a bit late and not part of a long-term strategy and plan. And I think it's really important for Australia to have consistency in diplomatic relationships and consistency in foreign policy. And if we're seen to be kind of moving this piece here and this piece here without that plan, I think that that's not a good thing. It's interesting what Alan says about our power and our potential influence and our agency in the region in particular. And I think one of the things that we've not done well is we haven't used that very well. One of the things that gives us that agency is we have a reputation nationally as being a straight talker and an honest broker. And that is valuable, particularly in cultures where there is a bit more reticence that things can't necessarily be said outright, that they have to go around things a bit more, and that diplomatically it's not done quite that way. The directness of Australia can be useful to some of our allies and our neighbours in some contexts, but it needs to be done with people coming along, with countries coming along, with countries being on board and knowing what we're about. And I think what we've been doing is not communicating well our intentions when we as a country make some forays, like the investigation into China and the origins of COVID-19. They didn't build support for that around the region before they announced it, and that was noted. And so we're almost undermining our own reputation as being a straight talker and an honest broker by not doing the legwork in advance and by being inconsistent. And that is undermining the agency that we have. And it also treats our neighbours in particular with disrespect. And so there's a bit of a sense that maybe we're not capitalising on the influence and role that we have. We've started to make these loans and grants and things like that, and that is one way we can do it. But the other way we can do it is by being upfront with countries that are important to us and consistent. And I think that is still lacking.
We might move shortly to questions from the audience. I know we've got about 470 people on the webinar at the moment. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're coming from all across the country. Before we move to questions, Alan, the International and Security Affairs program at the Australia Institute is relatively recent. Before we move to questions from the audience, and for people who might not be familiar with this new branch of our work, would you mind just talking a little bit about it and why the Institute thought it was important?
Certainly, Ebony. I mean, it's a great privilege to be here doing this job because the Institute, its work is generally speaking around applied social policy, whether it's climate policy, which is absolutely right at the top of the tree at the moment and will be for a long time, whether it's tax policy, whether it's any of the many issues surrounding the nature of work and so on. But all of those things we all recognise are deeply connected into the way in which the global community operates generally. Now, what we've tended often in Australia to do is to look at international and security affairs as being a kind of very specialist part of the work where everybody gets into the cloister, they close all the doors, they all talk to each other in secret language, they put code words on everything so that you can't tell everybody else what you're talking about. There's a good reason for that because most of it's nonsense. And so we sort of disaggregate our global connectiveness from the issues that we're dealing with. And so what the board did is to say, well, no, actually, everything does connect one to another. So let's have a look at how climate and issues around development assistance, big global issues like the coronavirus that's just hit us. We've done some interesting work already on the limits to extended nuclear deterrence and on matters relating to nuclear weapons. So all of these things impact on every part of people's security and well-being. And that's led us into some quite, I think, adventurous work on rethinking what we actually mean by security. Who owns it? Where does it come from? And we've sort of come to the view that security starts with each individual citizen, and that if you don't have a secure and happy citizenry, then you can't have a secure and happy nation. So that's more or less where our program has come from. And yes, we're pretty new and we're not as sort of developed as some of our partner organisations like LOE and others, but we're making really big strides, I think, in seeking to ensure that the things we address domestically are tied properly into the way in which the rest of the global community is trying to deal with exactly the same things. And a good example of that, of course, is the interesting work we're now doing through our Nordic policy unit.
Thanks, Alan. That's an excellent shout out there at the end. The first question that I've got here is from Jemima Garrett. She asks, what role do you see for the creative use of Australian broadcasting and media in the region as a way of deepening the conversation and for raising the level of awareness of various issues in the region and within Australia? I might start with you on that one, Karen.
What a surprise. I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's been a bit of a fraught issue in the recent past with the Australian network and the like, and how successive governments have viewed that as a tool of diplomacy, and the danger that it becomes an extension of Australian national propaganda, for want of a better word. That's always a dangerous word to use. But how independent that kind of media network is, and what image of Australia we're presenting to the region. And so there's always been some tension around that, and then which network has the contract to do it became a big issue in Australia. The coalition government was unhappy if the ABC was doing it. They felt that the kinds of emphasis on issues and the way things were being presented was not necessarily what they wanted. Then there was a move to let Sky do it, and then the critics came against that in the reverse. So I think there is value in communicating Australia's priorities and values. It's difficult if we haven't worked out what they are and don't have the consistent message to do that properly. But then there's always going to be this issue of well, how are we presenting them? And it often gets seen through the prism of domestic politics, which is a problem. But I do think it's important that that other countries understand us as Australians, understand what we think is important, understand the way we think and what we value, and communicating that sort of thing through media is valuable, is important.
Jonathan, Alan, anything you'd like to add to that?
I agree completely.
Distinct.
I would only emphasise the point that Karen made, but she made it in the politest of ways, and that is that a proper public diplomacy has got to be pretty independent of government direction or bureaucratic direction. The Radio Australia used to be pretty independent, just telling stories about Australia, but not with bias in them. And I think if we're going to use multi-platforms and multimedia to represent ourselves, we should represent ourselves as we really are, capable of having many conversations at once and inclusive of diversity. And I think we've got to be very careful that we don't create a kind of applied Voice of America, which I think is wonderful, but it's wonderful for America, not so much for us. So we've just got to be careful that we do maintain a high level of autonomy in the agencies that are employed to deal with reaching out through the media across Asia and the world more broadly.
And I should add, as an extension to that argument, that of course we're a democracy, and if we're really espousing democratic values, then a free media, the free flow of ideas, the contest of ideas is at the heart of that. And you look a little bit weird if you're saying you're a democracy that believes in all these things, but then you're trying to control all the information and the way that it goes to other countries. We criticise some more autocratic regimes for doing that and for restricting the access to information and communications. It would hardly be a good idea to practice the same thing ourselves and then sort of undermine our own arguments about democratic rights and freedoms.
The next question is from Tess Kane. The Pacific Step Up has been a signature foreign policy. What is needed to see it evolve from something that is done to or for the Pacific and into something that is done with the Pacific? Jonathan, I might come to you on that one.
I think Australia has always had a problem, and it's coming out now in terms of its this is I'll start with a big picture philosophical approach to Australia, but a lot of this is about how Australia sees itself and its place in the world. Patrick Lawrence's piece is interesting. He's an American, and he talks about Australia's outlook. He calls for Australia to see itself as a Pacific country, but Australia's struggled to see itself as a really fully fledged part of this region, and it still sees itself and its character and its values very much, I think, in terms of its historical links to Britain and the US. So I know that might sound vague and sort of theoretical, but we see this repeatedly affecting our foreign policy. So, for instance, Karen talked about the call for a COVID-19 inquiry. Who did Scott Morrison call to discuss that with? He called Trump. He called Angela Merkel. He called Emmanuel Macron. He couldn't call Boris Johnson, who was in hospital at the time with COVID-19. He didn't call any leaders in this region to discuss that inquiry, which was a great failure. And you might say, well, is that a one-off? No, because Karen's piece, for instance, talks about Rudd. Rudd's call for the Asia Pacific community, which is sort of going back to, I think, around 2009. And you saw exactly the same thing again. I mean, that really fell down because Australia did not go to the region and set up Rudd's announcement and go and discuss that big grand plan of his before announcing it. So in terms of how we see, in terms of Tessa's question about our ability to see ourselves, sort of as a member of the Pacific, I think this is a deep-rooted problem. I mean, I agree completely with Tessa's question or premise. We do fail to see ourselves as a part of this region, the Pacific, and the Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, and it affects our foreign policy repeatedly. I think there are a lot of good things about the Pacific Step Up, and it is good to see Australia turning its attention to the Pacific. But the way in which we approach that and some of the rhetoric surrounding that has been really problematic and reflective of this just kind of deep-seated inability to sort of see our place in the world, I think, as it actually is.
Yeah, for a bunch of politicians who pay very close attention to domestic policy, politics, I think the failure to even just pick up the phone to your neighbours seems like a pretty egregious oversight. And correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, but perhaps diplomacy 101 would be to pick up the phone before you make announcements like that. Alan, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I certainly think that picking up the phone to your neighbours is a very good idea. I mean, the Prime Minister could have spoken to the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who, a bit like Dan Andrews, had been very successful early in standing on the neck of the coronavirus. And we knew already that there were serious problems likely in Indonesia. So it would have been very, very timely for the Prime Minister to have spoken to Joko Widodo. And I don't know why he didn't. Similarly, the Prime Minister of Singapore, who had very, very good early success, but then had a big breakout because one very important part of their migrant community was simply not looked at. So I think talking to your neighbours is always extremely valuable when you're dealing with a global problem. I just want to add one thing to the remarks that Jonathan just made. I think a lot of people were a bit surprised at the choice of venue that the Prime Minister made to announce his Pacific Step Up. At least I was, because you don't normally go to 3 Brigade in Townsville to make a statement about what you're going to do in your overseas development program. And so to do it in a way which, as it were, represents it through the colour of khaki is pretty strange, I think. And that, again, is one of these sort of messaging problems that we seem to have all the time. Not just that we're not consistent in our messaging, but that we add to the messages all sorts of overtones which confuse our region rather than give them confidence. And, I mean, as you've touched upon and as Karen has touched upon, the idea that we have a kind of Indo-Pacific that brings India into the operations of the Pacific is a pretty big ambit. And, you know, to be thinking that we would have a Quad, for instance, but not think, first of all, of what kind of an arrangement more broadly would we like to have with Indonesia in it is really quite extraordinary. And so I do think that we need to be very much more deliberate and forward-looking in the way in which we craft our foreign policy, and not simply get out our ancient recipe books from 100 years ago and think that the same ingredients and the same way of putting them together is going to work for the modern taste and the modern diet.
The next question I've got is from Alice Ridge. She says, adopting a feminist foreign policy would be one way for Australia to position itself in allyship with progressive nations around the world, and would also provide a unifying framework for foreign policy and many of the strategies discussed today, like multilateralism, diplomacy, aid, and climate policy. And she asks, what are the panel's views on this as a bold move for Australia? I might start with you, Karen.
I guess it depends what you mean by feminist foreign policy. If you mean a focus on equal rights and equal opportunities for women, we do have one, but it's probably not promoted as heavily as it once was. And maybe we could emphasise that a little bit more. I think what you don't want to do is to be ending up having the opposite effect, which is sound like you're alienating or you're narrowing the scope of your foreign policy. But certainly we should live the values that we espouse, and we should incorporate them deeply in our diplomacy and our foreign policy. We should have policy that reflects what we say we believe in. And we're a country that doesn't believe in equality, equal rights, equal pay, equal opportunities for everyone. And so it isn't just about women, but it's about inequality of socioeconomic status and a whole lot of things that we probably could do better on in terms of living the values that we espouse and reflecting those in our foreign policy. And increasingly we're seeing foreign policy one-off gestures, as I've talked about, that don't necessarily reflect what our official policy is, and that may be confusing, as Alan says, to not only our neighbours but further afield. What do we really stand for? What do we really believe in? So in that sense, yes, of course, I think we should have a foreign policy that is extremely focused on the need to promote equality and equal opportunity for men, women, all genders. But further afield, diversity more generally, and on the socio-economic front as well.
Alan, that idea of feminist foreign policy came out of, correct me if I'm wrong, some of the Nordic countries. Are there any other kind of policy inspirations along those lines that you think Australia could learn from?
I think we could learn quite a lot from New Zealand, and we could learn a very, very great amount just by listening to women in Australia. I've got no problems actually with a feminist foreign policy. I know that a lot of other people will balk at the word feminist, and you'll have women saying that they're not feminists and blokes complaining about the word feminist, but I've got no problems with it, and I'll tell you why. I've belonged to and worked in the national sort of foreign policy and security community for well over 40 years, and it's comprised mostly of blokes. And I think it is actually deeply gendered. I mean, you read all of the documents going back over 100 years. Go back to Deakin and look at Deakin enunciating foreign policy. And foreign policy and security policy were all the business of men. Women didn't do that sort of thing. And if women were going to do anything, they could go and run the hospitals, but only the nursing part of it, of course. They couldn't do the operations. That's men's work. And I think it's high time, and this is what I get out of what Karen just said, it's high time that we had very conscious gender balance in the way in which we administer ourselves nationally, from the parliament right across the bureaucracy and everywhere else. And if people are frightened of that and they think that that's going to lead to a feminist foreign policy, well, just get used to it, boyo, because that's where it's going to go.
So probably a great observation. Jonathan, I might ask you next. There's a couple of questions here about the perceived China threat and how much of that can be put down to the military-industrial complex and kind of the hawks involved in the debate, and how much of that relies on ignoring some of the US's history in invading lots of countries all over the place. How does that contrast?
Yeah, I think it's a very. I think there are a lot of factors at play here, because I think that the military-industrial complex is a part of American foreign and defence policy. It's the biggest military spender in the world by far. It's got a huge military industry. And players from that industry lobby the government, and Washington is filled with lobbyists who have a lot of influence, and that ends up affecting American foreign policy. Of course, Trump came in saying he was going to drain the swamp, and he was referring, directly to that sort of lobbying. It hasn't happened. Of course, it hasn't. And in fact, to some extent, he did the opposite. I mean, he took on people like Rex Tillerson, the former ExxonMobil head, as his initial Secretary of State. So that sector in American society does play an influence, definitely, and I think it's continuing to influence the way America sees China and its approach to foreign policy. I think another element is just there are hawks in Washington. There are hawks everywhere who have ideological concerns, and China is very much playing into them. I mean, there are a lot of people in Washington who are still carrying on notions from the first Cold War as they approach this current competition with China. So there's a lot of ideological baggage which is affecting how America sees China. And I think it's really important to be aware of that. I also think that we cannot ignore China's own behaviour. It doesn't help when you have these wolf warrior diplomats speaking incredibly aggressively and really disrupting conversation on the world stage. It doesn't help when China acts this aggressively and sometimes mysteriously in the South China Sea. Xi Jinping is not a leader who holds press conferences to explain his position and to explain what China is doing. So I think that is an element that we can't ignore. That and in a sense they affect each other because the sort of opacity around China's intentions and around Xi Jinping's intentions leave a lot of room for people to kind of fill in the gap with their own ideological presumptions.
Alan, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think Jonathan nailed it.
Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left before we'll have to wrap up. And I know a lot of the conversation at the moment tends to focus around the United States and China. But I did want to bring us back to Indonesia because there's a couple of questions here about that. So I wonder if I could get each of the panelists to reflect on Australia's relationship with Indonesia. And I've got a question here from Louise Fitzgerald and a couple of other people asking, could it be a buffer to China and a good neighbour to Australia if we manage the relationship better? And linking that into the idea that's been floating around of Australia has to diversify away from China in terms of trade and exports and things like that. Are we ignoring Indonesia? What more can we be doing there? I'll start with you, Karen.
Well, I do think we're not investing well enough in that relationship, and we're in danger of being seen as a bit shallow because we're suddenly seeing a lot of these relationships through the prism of China. The Pacific Step Up, I agree with what was said about the backdrop of that and the uniforms and the like. The Pacific Step Up's motivation was we're worried about the level of influence of China in the region, and now we're seeing the influence of China through COVID-19 in Southeast Asia as well. But, I mentioned in my essay, and I'm fond of reflecting on this saying, an old saying that John Howard used to have, which was, you can't fatten the pig on market day, which means you need to be investing, consistently over a long period of time in whatever your project is, and including relationships with Indonesia. And I fear that we just haven't grasped that. Our business, corporate sector hasn't invested adequately in Indonesia. It's seen as a difficult environment for investment, complex overlays of corruption and complex regulation, and so that it's been easier to go elsewhere, including to China. And diplomatically too, we've done things that have offended Indonesia. We don't seem to have put in the legwork as a national government. Certainly our diplomats do, but to invest in that relationship. You reflect back over the last 20 years, there was a lot more effort and energy, and the relationship felt a lot more present and connected than it does at the moment. So I do think it's really important that we invest in a genuine sense over a long period of time, and not only when we suddenly panic and see that there might be things happening across our region where we really need good friends all of a sudden, because it just doesn't work like that.
Jonathan, what about you?
Yeah, I think it's a really great failing on Australia's part, and I think there are two things we have to worry about. The first is our own economic prosperity. Indonesia is a huge country. I think it's the third most populous country in the world, but 400 million people, a growing middle class. This is a country that we should be doing business with, and we don't. We do much more trade with Hong Kong than we do with China, than with Indonesia. We're just seeing at the moment companies like Coca-Cola kind of winding down their businesses there that have had a long presence there. So we're going backwards. This is a huge problem, and particularly if we think that we're going to need to diversify away from China because of the current tensions with China. We can't do that without Indonesia. So that's the first problem, and then the second problem is our own security. Indonesia is potentially our greatest security partner in the region. We should be working towards that and building up Indonesia. We have to stop thinking about Indonesia in terms of the way we used to as an enemy and as a strategic enemy. We have a lot of shared interests with Indonesia, and they are our next door neighbour, which is something we often tend to forget. So I think both in terms of security and economy, we need to start acting immediately.
And Alan, a final word from you.
Tiada banyak orang-orang Australia yang berbicara bahasa Indonesia. Very few Australians can speak to Indonesians because we don't speak their language. We are defiantly monolingual, and we look at Indonesia as a place you fly over in order to get to Europe. I think it's really terrible. We have big investments to make there. We've got a bit of practice, though. We've had a very long and quite good relationship with Malaysia and Singapore over many years in the defence business. We've had a reasonable defence relationship on and off with Indonesia, but we've got to go beyond defence and think about security from the point of view of human security. And that's where I think Karen is bang on the money in thinking about coronavirus as a kind of little keyhole in which we can move more broadly into the way in which human security issues are thought about and addressed more broadly in Southeast Asia. And Indonesia is the key. It's not a buffer. Actually, it's not a buffer to anything. It is a partner. And the more constructively we can think of working with Asia in terms of partnership, then the more secure all of us are going to be, including China.
Terima kasih. I think that's the only Indonesian that I remember. I learned that in year 7, but we weren't big on languages at Bomo High. We might wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Alan, Jonathan, and Karen. We really appreciate your time today. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. We appreciate your interest. As I said, don't forget to head to AustralianForeignAffairs.com to download, order your copy of Australian Foreign Affairs if you haven't already.
This has been a special summer episode of Follow the Money. All our webinars are free and available on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel. All our latest research and content is at our website, australiainstitute.org.au, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a N_T. Karen Middleton is at Karen M. Middleton, and Allan Behm is at Miranda Process. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeat from Pulse and Thrum. And remember, stay safe this summer, and thanks for listening.